When renowned black surgeon Dr. Elijah Harper learns that a critically ill black woman, Clara Simmons, has been repeatedly dismissed by medical professionals, he uncovers a shocking web of racism and systemic corruption in healthcare. A white doctor, Michael Daniels, has ignored and falsified patient cases, putting profits over lives. Despite facing microaggressions, outright prejudice, and attempts to silence him, Elijah fights to expose the injustices that cost vulnerable patients their dignity and health. This powerful story sheds light on the deep-rooted racism in America's healthcare system, and one man's relentless battle for accountability and change. The icy wind bit through Alan Carter's jacket as he trudged up the worn steps of Mayfair Apartments. Each step sent a jolt of pain through his swollen ankle, but the desperation in his chest outweighed the physical discomfort. Alan had been working double shifts all month, and he couldn't afford to miss another day. Yet every time he moved, the sharp, tearing sensation in his ankle reminded him of the accident on the warehouse floor. He reached his door, fumbling with his keys. The tiny apartment smelled faintly of damp wood and old coffee grounds. He tossed his bag onto the sagging couch, his breath shallow and quick as he leaned against the counter for support. The pain had started as a dull ache, but now it throbbed with a vengeance, radiating up his leg. Alan tried to shake it off. He had to. Tomorrow was payday, and the last thing he needed was a doctor's bill he couldn't cover. Slumping onto the couch, Alan grabbed his phone and hesitated. He stared at the screen, scrolling aimlessly through his contacts. Finally, he tapped the name he dreaded calling. "Hey, Rachel," he said, his voice strained but steady. I think I need a little help." The gentle hum of an espresso machine mingled with the low murmur of conversations as Dr. Elijah Harper pushed open the door to Stovall's diner. The warm, cinnamon-scented air hit him like a blanket after the bitter chill of the winter morning. It was his favorite kind of place, small, unassuming, and unpretentious. No grand entrances or reservations needed, just a spot where regular folks gathered for a cup of coffee and a plate of buttery pancakes. Elijah adjusted the scarf around his neck, brushing a dusting of snow off his tailored overcoat as he stepped inside. He liked to keep things simple, even if he didn't have to. As one of the most renowned cardiac surgeons in the country, his name graced medical journals and symposiums alike. His face had been splashed across glossy magazine covers with headlines proclaiming him a trailblazer in modern medicine. But none of that mattered to Elijah Harper in a place like Stovall's. He was here to blend in, not stand out. "Morning, Dr. Harper." A cheerful voice greeted him. Shelley, the young waitress who seemed to live behind the counter, waved a dishcloth at him before sliding a steaming coffee mug across the counter. "Morning, Shelley," Elijah replied, his deep baritone carrying easily across the diner. He offered her a warm smile as he slid onto his usual stool near the window. "How's your boy doing, James, isn't it?" Shelley's face lit up. "He's doing great. Got an A on his science project. Built one of those models of the solar system. You know, with the foam balls, wants to be an astronaut now." Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. "That's good to hear. Keep encouraging him." Behind the counter, Shelley beamed at the compliment as she refilled his coffee. She glanced at the surgical scar on his hand, something he often caught people noticing, but rarely mentioned. "You want the usual today?" "Just coffee for now, thanks," Elijah said, loosening his scarf and glancing around the diner. It was bustling as usual, with patrons tucked into vinyl booths or perched on bar stools. A group of men in work boots and Carhartt jackets laughed raucously over their plates of eggs and hash browns in the corner, while a woman near the back wrestled with a crying toddler. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, blanketing the street in pristine white. Elijah appreciated places like this. They reminded him of where he came from, the narrow streets of his childhood neighborhood in Newark, where every corner store had a story, and every neighbor knew your name even now, with a resume that could rival the best in the field, and a bank account that could buy any indulgence he desired. Elijah still shopped at local markets, wore understated suits, and drove the same reliable sedan he'd had since med school. "Here you go, Doc." Shelley set a plate of toast in front of him without asking. "On the house, you're always looking out for everybody else. Least I can do is look out for you." Elijah started to protest, but Shelley waved him off. "You're not paying for it, so don't even try." He shook his head, smiling as he took a bite. "Thanks, Shelley. You're too kind." From the corner of his eye, he noticed a pair of new faces at the far end of the counter, a man and a woman, both dressed in sleek designer coats that screamed money. They didn't quite fit the typical Stovall's crowd. The man, a well-groomed professional type in his mid-30s, glanced at Elijah briefly, his eyes narrowing slightly before returning to the menu in his hands. The woman with him whispered something, her gaze lingering on Elijah for a beat longer. Elijah was used to that look, the curious, sometimes skeptical glances that trailed him whenever he stepped into spaces that didn't immediately align with people's expectations. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. He kept his focus on his coffee, letting the warm bitterness ground him. As he sipped, the door jingled open again, and a flurry of snowflakes followed a young man into the diner. He looked to be in his early 20s, tall and lanky, with a nervous energy that radiated from his every movement. His clothes were wrinkled, his sneakers scuffed, and he clutched a manila envelope so tightly his knuckles turned white. Hi," the young man stammered, approaching the counter. His voice cracked slightly as he addressed Shelley. "I'm looking for Dr. Harper." Elijah straightened in his seat, setting his coffee down. "That'd be me. What can I do for you?" The young man turned toward him, relief flashing across his face. "Dr. Harper, I'm sorry to bother you like this, but I didn't know where else to go. My mom, she's really sick, her heart, and I heard you're the best." Elijah's brow furrowed as he stood, motioning for the young man to sit next to him. "Take a deep breath," he said gently. "Start from the beginning." The young man slid onto the stool, his hands trembling as he opened the envelope and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Her name's Clara Simmons. She's been having these episodes. Shortness of breath, dizziness, chest pain. We've been to 3 hospitals, and they keep saying it's stress, but it's not. I know it's not." Elijah's jaw tightened at the familiar story. Too many times, he'd seen cases where patients, particularly black patients, had their symptoms dismissed or downplayed. He flipped through the papers, scanning the test results and discharge notes the young man had brought with him. "When was her last episode?" Elijah asked, his tone serious now. "Yesterday," the young man replied. "She collapsed. I thought she was going to die right there on the kitchen floor." Elijah nodded, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. "Okay, first, you did the right thing by coming here. Second, I'm going to make some calls. We'll figure this out." The young man's shoulders sagged with relief, tears welling in his eyes. Thank you so much." As Elijah pulled out his phone to contact a colleague at the local hospital, he felt the weight of the stares from the couple at the end of the counter. The man was whispering something to the woman now, gesturing subtly in Elijah's direction. "Excuse me," the man said finally, his voice cutting through the din of the diner. "You're Dr. Harper?" Elijah turned, his expression neutral. "That's correct." The man's gaze was sharp, assessing. "I didn't expect to find you here." "Here?" Elijah asked evenly, raising an eyebrow. "At a place like this," the man clarified, gesturing around the diner. "Not exactly what I'd imagine for someone of your stature." Elijah's smile was polite, his tone unwavering. "I'm a firm believer in supporting local businesses. Besides, the coffee's better here than at the hospital cafeteria." The woman gave a forced laugh, nudging the man to drop the subject. But the moment lingered. Elijah turned back to the young man beside him, offering him a reassuring nod as he resumed his phone call. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the streets in silence. Inside, the tension hung heavy in the air, a subtle reminder that no matter how far he'd come, the world still had its ways of questioning his place in it. Elijah had just finished his call, arranging for Clara Simmons to be seen by one of his trusted colleagues at a nearby hospital, when he felt a shadow loom over him. The man from the end of the counter had left his seat and now stood just a few feet away, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His expression was polite, but there was an edge to it, a subtle hardness in his eyes that spoke louder than any words. "Dr. Harper," the man began, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you really a doctor?" Elijah turned slowly, keeping his features composed despite the knot tightening in his chest. It wasn't the first time he'd been asked that question, but it never failed to stir something deep and raw within him. He met the man's gaze directly, his baritone steady and firm. "Yes, I am." The man raised an eyebrow, his skepticism barely concealed. "And where did you study? Somewhere local?" "I attended Johns Hopkins for my medical degree," Elijah replied evenly. "Completed my residency there as well. Anything else you'd like to know?" His tone was polite, but there was an undeniable edge of steel beneath it. The man blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but he quickly recovered. No, just curious. You don't exactly look like a heart surgeon." He chuckled, glancing over his shoulder at the woman who accompanied him. She offered a weak smile, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to interject. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he forced a calm smile. "And what exactly does a heart surgeon look like?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. The man faltered, his confidence wavering. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said, his tone defensive now. "It's just, you don't see many doctors stopping by places like this." "People tend to make a lot of assumptions," Elijah said, his smile fading slightly. "But I'm here because I like the coffee. If you'll excuse me." He turned his attention back to the young man beside him, who sat frozen in awkward silence, clearly unsure how to react. The man hesitated for a moment longer before retreating to his seat, muttering something under his breath that Elijah chose to ignore. He felt the familiar burn of frustration rising in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. He had learned long ago how to mask his emotions, how to navigate moments like this with grace, even when every fiber of his being screamed to call it out for what it was. "Is he bothering you, Doc?" Shelley's voice cut through the tension like a lifeline. She had been watching the exchange from behind the counter, her sharp eyes flicking between Elijah and the man. "I'm fine, Shelley," Elijah said with a small smile, grateful for her concern. "Thanks." The young man beside him shifted uncomfortably, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Dr. Harper. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." "You didn't," Elijah said firmly, meeting the young man's gaze. "You did the right thing coming to me. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The young man nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, but the unease lingered. Elijah could feel it too. A heavy weight in the air, the unspoken tension that had settled over the diner like a cloud. He glanced at the clock on the wall, debating whether to stay or leave, when the bell over the door jingled again. 2 police officers entered, their presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the diner. They were both tall, broad-shouldered men in their 40s, their navy uniforms immaculate, and their expressions unreadable. They scanned the room briefly before approaching Shelley at the counter. "Morning," one of them said, his voice clipped and professional. "We got a call about a suspicious individual causing a disturbance." Elijah stiffened, a chill running down his spine. His eyes flicked to the man at the end of the counter, who was now whispering to the woman beside him, his expression smug. "There's no disturbance here," Shelley said quickly, her voice firm. "Just a regular morning." The officer didn't seem convinced. His gaze swept the room again before landing on Elijah. His eyes narrowed slightly as he stepped closer. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up." Elijah blinked, the absurdity of the situation momentarily stunning him into silence. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his tone calm but tinged with disbelief. "We received a report," the officer said, his voice firm but lacking detail. "I need to ask you a few questions." "About what?" Elijah asked, keeping his voice steady even as his pulse quickened. "I'm sitting here drinking coffee. Is that a crime now?" The second officer stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the radio at his shoulder. "Just cooperate, sir. We need to confirm some details." Elijah stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He raised his hand slightly, a reflex honed by years of understanding how quickly situations like this could escalate. The diner had gone deathly quiet, all eyes on him as he addressed the officers. "My name is Dr. Elijah Harper," he said, his voice steady. "I'm a cardiac surgeon. I was meeting with someone here about a medical issue. I'd like to know why that's a problem." The first officer frowned, clearly caught off guard by Elijah's response. "Do you have ID?" he asked, his tone slightly less confrontational now. Elijah reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his wallet and handing over his driver's license. The officer examined it briefly, his expression shifting as he read the name and title. "This doesn't make sense," the officer muttered under his breath, handing the ID back. "We'll need to verify this." Elijah felt a flicker of anger, but he pushed it down. "You can call St. James Medical Center," he said, his tone clipped. "They'll confirm everything. In the meantime, I'd like to know who made the report and why." The officers exchanged a glance, their unease growing. It was clear they were beginning to realize the situation wasn't as simple as they had been led to believe. The man at the end of the counter shifted in his seat, avoiding Elijah's gaze. "Look," Elijah continued, his voice firm but calm, "I understand you have a job to do, but I also have a job that saves lives, and right now, you're wasting my time. So unless you have a legitimate reason to detain me, I suggest you let me get back to my coffee." The second officer hesitated, then gave a small nod. "You're free to go, sir. Apologies for the inconvenience." Elijah sat back down, his movements measured as he reached for his coffee. The officers lingered for a moment longer before turning and leaving, the tension in the diner dissipating slightly as the door jingled shut behind them. Shelley appeared at his side almost instantly, her expression a mix of anger and concern. "I'm so sorry, Dr. Harper. That was uncalled for." "It's not your fault, Shelley," Elijah said quietly, his voice tinged with weariness. "It's just how things are." The young man beside him shifted uncomfortably, his voice trembling slightly. "Dr. Harper, I don't know how you stayed so calm. I was scared just watching." Elijah turned to him, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You get used to it," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean it's right." The man at the end of the counter avoided Elijah's gaze as he stood, tossing a few bills on the counter, before ushering the woman toward the door. Elijah watched them leave, the weight of the encounter settling over him like a familiar, unwelcome cloak. He took a long sip of his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and unrelenting. The diner slowly settled back into its routine after the police officers left. But for Elijah, the tension lingered. He could feel the eyes of other patrons on him, curious, wary, judgmental. Shelley did her best to lighten the mood, topping off his coffee and chatting about her son's science fair, but Elijah's thoughts were elsewhere. The man at the counter might have left, but the encounter still simmered in his mind. Elijah's phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. "Dr. Mitchell, St. James Medical Center." "Mitchell," Elijah answered, his voice steady despite the turmoil still brewing within him. "Elijah," Mitchell said, his tone urgent. "We need to talk. Something's come up." Elijah frowned. Mitchell, his colleague and occasional confidant, rarely called unless it was something important. "What is it?" "It's about a patient referral you made this morning," Mitchell said. "Clara Simmons. Her records just came through, and—" He hesitated, his voice dropping. "You're not going to like this. I think you should come in." "I'll be there in 15, Elijah said, already pulling out his wallet to pay. The roads to St. James Medical Center were slick with freshly fallen snow, the city's usual hustle muted under the weight of winter. Elijah navigated the familiar streets with precision, his mind racing with possibilities. Mitchell's tone had been grave, and it wasn't like him to exaggerate. By the time Elijah pulled into the hospital's parking garage, his chest was tight with unease. He stepped into the lobby, where the antiseptic smell and soft hum of fluorescent lights felt like second nature to him. Mitchell was waiting for him in a small conference room near the cardiology wing, his arms crossed and his face drawn tight. He motioned for Elijah to sit, then slid a thin file across the table. "I pulled Clara Simmons's records from the other hospital she visited," Mitchell began, his voice low. "She's been bounced around the system for weeks, symptoms dismissed, misdiagnosed, sent home with nothing but painkillers and a stress diagnosis." Elijah's stomach sank as he opened the file. The patterns were unmistakable. Routine tests with ambiguous results, cursory notes from ER doctors, and no follow-up care. It was a textbook case of systemic neglect, compounded by racial bias. "This is criminal," Elijah said, his voice tight with anger. "It gets worse," Mitchell said, leaning forward. Her most recent visit was at Hargrove. General look at the attending physician's notes. Elijah flipped to the last page, his eyes scanning the scrawled handwriting. Patient exhibits typical signs of anxiety-related chest pain, symptoms likely psychosomatic, recommend outpatient counseling. The signature at the bottom made Elijah's blood run cold. Dr. Michael Daniels. Daniels? Elijah said, incredulous. He's still practicing? Mitchell nodded grimly. Barely. He's been under investigation for months, but nothing stuck, and he's not the only one. There's a pattern here, Elijah. One that goes higher than we thought. Elijah sat back, his mind racing. Daniels had been a controversial figure for years, known for cutting corners and dismissing patients. Particularly those from underserved communities. Elijah had clashed with him before, during a case that had nearly cost a young woman her life, but Daniels had skated by, with little more than a slap on the wrist. This isn't just about Daniels, Mitchell continued. I've been looking into the administration at Hargrove. There's evidence that they've been pressuring staff to minimize costs, refusing to admit patients who can't afford to pay or don't have clear symptoms. Clara's not the only one who suffered because of it. Elijah's jaw tightened as he closed the file. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the picture they painted was damning. Clara Simmons wasn't just a victim of medical negligence, she was a casualty of a system designed to fail people like her. Elijah's resolve hardened as he left the conference room. He walked briskly down the hall, his mind already formulating a plan. He couldn't let this go. Clara's case, and the countless others like it, deserved justice. As he reached his office, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. Dr. Harper, he answered curtly. A familiar voice greeted him. Dr. Harper, this is Officer Daniels. Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. Officer Daniels. What can I do for you? There was a pause on the line, the kind that carried unspoken tension. I wanted to follow up on the incident at Stovall's this morning. There's been some concern raised about your conduct. My conduct? Elijah repeated, his voice icy. Someone filed a complaint, Daniels said, his tone measured. They allege that you were confrontational and uncooperative with law enforcement. We take these reports seriously, Doctor. Elijah clenched his jaw, the words catching in his throat. He forced himself to take a deep breath before responding. I see. And who, exactly, filed this complaint? I'm not at liberty to disclose that, Daniels said smoothly. But I'd advise you to tread carefully. These things have a way of escalating. Elijah's mind raced, the implications of Daniels' words clear. This wasn't just about the diner. It was a warning, a veiled threat meant to silence him before he could dig any deeper into Clara's case or Hargrove's practices. Thank you for your concern, officer, Elijah said, his tone calm but resolute. If you'll excuse me, I have patients to attend to. He ended the call, his hand trembling as he set the phone down. The walls were closing in, and the stakes had never felt higher. By the time Elijah left the hospital that evening, the sky had darkened, and the snow had turned to sleet. His car was parked at the far end of the lot, the faint glow of a street lamp casting long shadows across the pavement. As he approached, he noticed a figure leaning against the driver's side door. It was Daniels. Long day, Doctor? Daniels said, his voice casual, but his posture tense. Elijah stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing. What do you want, Daniels? I just thought we should talk, Daniels said, stepping closer. Man to man, you've been stirring up a lot of trouble lately, and it's starting to get noticed. Trouble? Elijah repeated, his voice dangerously calm. Is that what you call advocating for patients who've been ignored and mistreated? Daniels smirked, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. You're playing a dangerous game. Harper Hargrove has deep pockets and powerful friends. You really think you can take them on? Elijah took a step closer, his voice low and steady. I don't care about their pockets or their friends. Clara Simmons deserves justice, and so do the countless others who've been failed by this system. If you think I'm going to back down, you're sorely mistaken. For a moment, Daniels's smirk faltered, but it quickly returned. You're going to regret this, he said, his voice a whisper now. People like you always do. Elijah didn't flinch. If doing the right thing means I have to face people like you, then so be it. Daniels stepped back, his expression dark. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Elijah alone in the freezing lot. Elijah stood there for a long moment, his breath fogging in the cold air. The path ahead was clear now, but it wasn't going to be easy. Daniels was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that Elijah was determined to confront head-on. As he climbed into his car, the sleet tapping against the windshield, Elijah felt a steely resolve settle over him. The fight wasn't over, but he wasn't backing down. The following morning, Elijah Harper woke to the relentless buzzing of his phone on the nightstand. He blinked against the pale winter light filtering through his curtains and reached for it, his stomach sinking when he saw Mitchell's name flashing on the screen. "Mitchell?" Elijah answered, his voice hoarse from sleep. "Elijah, you need to get down here," Mitchell said, his tone urgent. "It's Clara Simmons. They brought her into the ER an hour ago. She collapsed at home. It's bad." Elijah bolted upright, his heart pounding. "What happened?" "Her heart," Mitchell replied grimly. "They're prepping her for surgery, but the damage is extensive. If they'd caught this sooner." The unspoken words hung heavy between them. Elijah didn't need to hear the rest. He was already out of bed, throwing on clothes. "I'm on my way." By the time Elijah arrived at St. James Medical Center, the controlled chaos of the ER was in full swing. Nurses moved briskly between rooms, monitors beeped in rhythmic patterns, and the low hum of hurried conversation filled the air. Elijah spotted Mitchell near the nurses' station, his face lined with exhaustion. "She's stable for now," Mitchell said, as Elijah approached. "But barely the surgical team is doing everything they can." Elijah's jaw clenched as he processed the news. "This could have been avoided," he said, his voice low and sharp. "If Daniels, or any of them, had taken her symptoms seriously, she wouldn't be in this position." Mitchell sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, and I've been digging deeper into Hargrove. Elijah. It's worse than we thought. Daniels wasn't just negligent. He's part of a system that's been actively burying cases like Clara's to cut costs. I found evidence of falsified records, misdiagnoses, and patients being turned away." Elijah's hands curled into fists. "This isn't just malpractice, it's criminal." "That's not all," Mitchell continued, lowering his voice. "I heard from someone on the board they've caught wind of your involvement in Clara's case, and they're not happy. There's talk of discrediting you." Elijah stared at him, the weight of the words sinking in. He wasn't surprised, but the blatant audacity of it still stung. "They're trying to protect themselves," he said. "But I'm not backing down." Elijah spent the rest of the day oscillating between Clara's room and his office. As he reviewed her records, his anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. Mitchell's revelations confirmed what Elijah had long suspected. The system wasn't broken, it was rigged. Patients like Clara, marginalized and without resources, were deemed expendable, and those responsible hid behind bureaucracy and veiled threats. Elijah wasn't willing to let it continue. By late afternoon, he had a plan. He gathered copies of Clara's records, the evidence Mitchell had uncovered, and detailed notes of his own. Then he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Harper," a familiar voice answered on the third ring. "It's been a while." "Too long," Elijah said, his tone measured. "I need your help, Kim. I've got a case, multiple cases actually, that expose systemic malpractice at Hargrove General. I want to take it public." Kim Price, an investigative journalist with a reputation for taking down corrupt institutions, let out a low whistle. "You don't play small, do you?" "Not when lives are on the line," Elijah replied. "Send me what you've got," Kim said. "If it's as big as you say, I'll run with it. But you know what this means, Elijah. Once this goes live, they'll come for you." "They already are," Elijah said. "I'm not afraid of them." Later that evening, Elijah sat alone in his office, the glow of his computer screen casting sharp shadows across the room. He had just finished sending Kim the files when there was a knock at his door. "Come in," he called, turning to see Mitchell enter, a file folder clutched in his hand. "Elijah, we need to talk," Mitchell said, his expression tense. "What is it now?" Elijah asked, bracing himself. Mitchell hesitated, then handed him the folder. "It's about Daniels. He knows you're pushing this, and he's retaliating. He's filed a formal complaint against you with the medical board, claiming you've been overstepping your bounds and interfering in cases that aren't yours. Elijah flipped open the folder, scanning the pages. The accusations were thinly veiled attempts to discredit him, full of vague language and insinuations. It was exactly the kind of move he had expected from Daniels, but it still sent a spike of anger through him. "This is desperation," Elijah said, closing the folder with a snap. "He knows he's cornered." Mitchell nodded. "Maybe, but the board will take this seriously if they suspend you." "They won't," Elijah said firmly. "I won't give them the chance." The next morning, Elijah's phone buzzed with a series of notifications. Kim's article had gone live, the headline bold and damning: "Neglect and Greed, the Hidden Crisis at Hargrove General." The story detailed Clara's case and others like hers, painting a picture of systemic failures that prioritized profit over patient care. It named names, including Daniels, and called for a full investigation. The response was immediate. Within hours, the article had gone viral, sparking outrage across social media and drawing the attention of local news outlets. Patients shared their own stories of neglect and mistreatment, their voices amplifying the chorus of anger and demands for accountability. At St. James, Elijah's day was anything but routine. Whispers followed him through the halls, and colleagues offered wary glances or quiet words of support. Mitchell cornered him in the break room, his phone in hand. "Elijah, this is blowing up," he said, showing him the trending hashtags. "But Daniels isn't going down without a fight. He's already called a press conference to set the record straight." Elijah's jaw tightened. Let him talk. The evidence speaks for itself. But even as he said the words, he knew the fight wasn't over. Daniels wasn't just a man, he was a symptom of a larger disease, one that wouldn't be eradicated easily. The day reached its boiling point when Elijah was called to an emergency meeting with the hospital board. He entered the conference room to find a dozen pairs of eyes fixed on him, some sympathetic, others cold and calculating. At the head of the table sat Dr. Geraldson, the board's chair, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Harper," Geraldson began, his tone measured. "I assume you're aware of the article published this morning." "I am," Elijah said, standing tall. "And I stand by every word of it." Geraldson's lips pressed into a thin line. "This has put the hospital in a difficult position. While we support transparency, the manner in which you've gone about this has raised concerns." "Concerns?" Elijah repeated, his voice calm but firm. "I exposed malpractice that's cost lives. If that's a concern, then perhaps we need to reevaluate our priorities." A murmur rippled through the room, some board members exchanging uneasy glances. Geraldson cleared his throat. "Be that as it may, we cannot ignore the ramifications of your actions. Daniels has filed a complaint against you, and we are obligated to investigate." Elijah's gaze swept the room, his resolve unshaken. "Investigate all you want. You'll find that I've done nothing but advocate for patients who've been ignored and mistreated. Can Daniels say the same?" Geraldson hesitated, then leaned forward. "Dr. Harper, I advise you to tread carefully. This institution cannot afford unnecessary disruptions." Elijah met his gaze head-on. "Neither can the patients who trust us with their lives." As Elijah left the meeting, his phone buzzed with a message from Kim. "Daniels just went live. Watch carefully, he's not holding back." Elijah found a quiet corner of the hospital and pulled up the stream. Daniels stood at a podium, flanked by lawyers, his expression carefully composed. "These allegations are baseless," Daniels said, his voice dripping with practiced indignation. "They are the result of a smear campaign orchestrated by individuals seeking to undermine the integrity of our healthcare system." Elijah's stomach churned as he listened. Daniels was a master manipulator, twisting the narrative to paint himself as the victim. But then, a reporter's question cut through the noise. "What about the evidence presented in the article?" the reporter asked. "The patient records, the testimonies." Daniels faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he regained his composure. "I cannot comment on ongoing investigations, but I trust that the truth will prevail." Elijah ended the stream, his resolve solidifying. Daniels might have played his hand, but the fight was far from over. Elijah had the truth on his side, and he wasn't going to stop until justice was served, Elijah Harper stood at the podium in the packed auditorium of St. James Medical Center, the harsh glare of the spotlights casting sharp shadows on the walls. The hospital board had called for an emergency press conference, ostensibly to address the controversy surrounding Clara Simmons's case and the damning revelations about systemic malpractice at Hargrove General. But Elijah knew the real purpose: damage control. The room buzzed with tension. Reporters filled every seat, cameras perched on tripods capturing every angle. At the edge of the stage, Dr. Michael Daniels leaned against the wall, his arms crossed and his expression smug. He was flanked by a group of legal representatives and PR handlers, their whispers barely audible over the hum of the crowd. Elijah adjusted the microphone, his pulse steady, despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for.